The gravel lot outside the Cutter County Fairgrounds was already thick with dust by 9 in the morning, kicked up by pickup trucks that kept rolling in long after the auction notice said to arrive. Men in canvas coats leaned against tailgates, coffee steaming in their hands, breath fogging in the October cold. A hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post read, "Auction today, Harmon Ranch, 640 acres." Eleanor Braddock stood near the back, arms crossed over a coat that had belonged to her husband, Wade. It still smelled faintly of diesel and hay, and she hadn't been able to make herself wash that smell out. 6 months a widow, 6 months of creditors calling the house in town, 6 months of watching the bank's letters pile up on the kitchen counter like snow she refused to shovel. She wasn't supposed to be here. Everyone in Cutter County knew that. "That's the Braddock girl," someone murmured behind her. Wade's widow. What in God's name is she doing at a land auction? Eleanor didn't turn around. She'd heard worse in the last half year, and she'd learned that the only thing to do with whispers was let them pass through her, like wind through a fence line. At the front, near the auctioneer's platform, stood the reason half the county had shown up. Not to bid, but to watch. Everett Colm, 52 years old, silver-templed, wearing a wool coat that cost more than most of these men's trucks. He owned feedlots in 3 counties and a meatpacking contract that stretched to Chicago. When Everett Colm wanted a piece of land, Everett Colm got it. Nobody in Cutter County had ever seen him lose. "Wonder what he wants with the old Harmon place," a rancher said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Ground's half dead. Fences are rotted through. Man could buy better land for less, 3 counties over." But Everett Colm didn't buy land for what it looked like. He bought land for what it meant. And something about this ranch, 640 acres of tired grass and sagging barns, had brought him out here personally instead of sending one of his men. The auctioneer climbed the platform, tapped the microphone, and the crowd went quiet. "Y'all know why we're here. Banks foreclosed on the Harmon estate. Everything sells today, as is, no warranties. We'll start with the land itself, 640 acres, improvements included." Eleanor's heart beat so hard she thought the man beside her might hear it. The bidding opened low, climbed fast. 2 local ranchers tried their luck and dropped out within minutes. Nobody could compete once Everett Colm raised 2 fingers, calm as a man ordering coffee. By the 3rd round, it was just him standing there, unchallenged, the crowd already murmuring about what he'd do with the ground once it was his. Then Eleanor raised her hand. The auctioneer blinked. The crowd turned. Even Colm's expression shifted. Just slightly. Not alarm, not yet. Curiosity. "Young ladies in," the auctioneer called out, and somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed. Colm raised the bid without hesitation. Eleanor raised hers again. He did it a 3rd time, easily, like flicking a fly off his sleeve, and still, Eleanor Braddock did not sit down. By the 5th exchange, the laughing had stopped. Nobody in that crowd could explain why a widow with a mortgaged house and 2 months of grocery credit at the general store was bidding against the richest man in the county for 600 acres of half-dead pasture. But there she stood, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the auctioneer, refusing to look away. And 40 minutes later, in front of the whole county, Everett Colm would lower his card and walk away from a piece of land he had wanted more than anything he'd bought in a decade. Nobody in that crowd knew why. Not yet. Eleanor barely believed it herself. 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor hadn't been thinking about ranches at all. She'd been thinking about her kitchen table and the letter sitting on it from Cutter County Savings and Loan, informing her that the note on her and Wade's small home place, 80 acres, 40 head of cattle, and a house that needed a new roof, was 90 days past due. Wade died in April. A tractor rollover on a slope he'd crossed 1,000 times before, on a morning so ordinary that Eleanor still couldn't make herself believe it had happened. He'd left behind good instincts, a fair name, and almost no money. A bad calving season the year before had eaten their savings, and the loan they'd taken to cover it was the one now threatening to take the house. Eleanor had grown up on her father's place 2 counties north, and if she'd inherited anything from him, it was a stubborn eye for land, not for how it looked, but for how it behaved. Her father had spent 30 years teaching soil conservation for the Extension Office, dragging young Eleanor along to every field day, every drought demonstration, every dried-up creek bed he wanted her to study before the rain came back. She knew grass. She knew how a pasture told the truth about what was underneath it, if you were patient enough to read it. It was a skill nobody in Cutter County thought much of, certainly nothing a bank would lend against. The trouble was, Wade's family had a history with the Harmon Ranch, a history Wade had only half explained before he died, in the offhand way men do when they think there will always be more time to finish a story. His grandfather had homesteaded that exact ground back in the 1910s, lost it in the 30s like half the county did, and Wade had grown up hearing his own father talk about buying it back someday. Wade never got his someday. But he used to drive past the Harmon place on the county road and go quiet in a way Eleanor had learned to recognize. Not sadness exactly, more like unfinished business. "There's water under that ground that never quits," he told her once, nodding toward the old cottonwoods lining a low draw on the property. "My grandpa used to say that spring never went dry, not even in 36, when everything else in this county turned to powder." Eleanor hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just Wade, telling family stories the way he always did, half memory and half myth. She thought about it a great deal after the bank's letter arrived. She drove out to the Harmon place on a grey Tuesday, telling herself she only wanted to look. The ranch had been vacant 2 years, ever since Old Man Harmon died, and his children, scattered across 3 states, none of them interested in cattle, let the place run down while probate dragged on. Fences sagged. The barn roof had a hole you could see sky through. Pasture grass stood brittle and pale, the kind of grass that told most people the ground was worthless. But Eleanor didn't look at most people's grass. She looked at the draw where the cottonwoods stood. Cottonwoods needed water, real water, steady water, not just what fell from the sky. And these trees weren't struggling like the rest of the property. They stood green-tinged even in a dry October, their roots clearly finding something the rest of the ranch couldn't. She walked the line of them for an hour, boots sinking slightly into ground that should have been hard as brick after a summer like the one they'd had. Deer tracks crossed and recrossed a narrow band of grass that stayed a shade greener than everything around it. Even in the driest stretch of pasture, a scattering of cattle bones, old, sun-bleached, years gone, lay clustered near that same low ground, as if animals had once gathered there and never wanted to leave. She didn't have proof of anything. She had a feeling, and a half-remembered story from a husband who wasn't there to confirm it. "You're wasting your time out here," her brother-in-law told her flatly when she mentioned the ranch at Sunday dinner. "That place is a money pit, Ellie. Everybody in the county knows it. You've got your own place to save. Let it go." For a while, she nearly did. She had 80 acres and 40 heads hanging by a thread, and here she was, walking someone else's dead pasture, chasing a story her husband never finished telling. It felt, some nights, like grief, wearing the shape of hope, the kind of thing a person invents so the hurting has somewhere to go. But she kept Wade's old field ledger from the shelf where it had sat untouched since April, and one night, flipping through his cramped handwriting, she found it, a single line, dated years back, tucked between notes on fence repair and a payment to the vet. Harmon Spring, Grandpa always said, never went dry. I should look into it someday. Someday was staring her in the face now, whether she'd asked for it or not. She wasn't the only one who noticed the cottonwoods. Everett Colm had his own reasons for wanting the Harmon Ranch, and none of them had anything to do with sentiment. His feedlot operation was expanding into Cutter County, and expansion meant water, dependable water, enough to run several hundred head through a finishing operation without hauling it in by truck. His engineers had flagged the Harmon property months earlier during a routine survey of regional water tables. The land looked unremarkable on paper, but paper didn't account for a spring that, according to old county records, had never once run dry in 60 years of drought cycles. Colm sent a hydrologist out to the property 2 weeks before the auction, quietly, the way he did most things. The man's report confirmed what the cottonwoods already knew: an artesian spring fed by an aquifer deeper and steadier than anything else in the county, surfacing right where Wade's grandfather always said it would. For Colm, it was exactly what he needed, until his lawyer called him back with something the hydrologist's report hadn't covered. Because a spring that never runs dry doesn't just feed cottonwoods, it feeds a creek, and that creek, records showed, had been supplying water to 3 downstream ranches under senior water rights dating back to territorial days, rights that predated anything Colm could buy or override. If he drained or diverted that spring to feed a feedlot operation, he wouldn't just be buying land, he'd be starting a water war with half the ranching families in the county, families whose cattle contracts he still needed for his own business to run. It was the kind of fight that could cost him more in lawsuits and ruined relationships than the land itself was worth. He didn't know it yet, standing at that auction with his card raised. He only suspected, and suspicion, for a man as careful as Everett Colm, was usually enough to make him look twice. The bidding at the fairgrounds climbed past what anyone expected the ranch to be worth, dollar for dollar, breath for breath. Eleanor's hands shook every time she raised her card, but her voice, when the auctioneer called on her, never did. "You sure about this, ma'am?" the auctioneer asked once, not unkindly, as the number climbed higher than anything he'd sold that season. "I'm sure," Eleanor said. Colm studied her from across the crowd, not with irritation, but something closer to genuine curiosity. A woman who should have folded 3 rounds ago wasn't folding. That told him something. Everett Colm hadn't built an empire by ignoring the moments when smart people refused to back down for no visible reason. He raised his card once more. Eleanor matched him. Then he did something nobody expected. He turned to his lawyer, standing at his elbow, and murmured a question too quiet for the crowd to catch. The lawyer leaned in and answered, low and fast. Colm's jaw tightened. The auctioneer called for another bid. Silence stretched across the fairgrounds, the kind of silence Cutter County would talk about for years afterward. Everett Colm looked once more at the cottonwoods visible beyond the fence line, at the ground he now understood carried more legal weight than dollar signs, and lowered his card. "I'm out," he said simply, and walked back toward his truck without another word. The auctioneer, stunned into a beat of silence himself, turned back to Eleanor. "Going once, going twice, sold, to the Braddock woman." The crowd didn't cheer. They just stared, trying to understand what they'd witnessed. Eleanor stood very still, feeling the ground shift beneath a debt she now owed, and a promise she'd somehow, impossibly, kept. It took her the better part of a year to understand the full shape of what she'd bought. The spring, once properly tested, proved reliable enough to support year-round grazing without a single dry summer costing her stock. She didn't drain it, divert it, or fight her downstream neighbors over it. She simply used it the way the land had always intended, modest and steady, running her small herd alongside water that had outlasted droughts, depressions, and every hard winter the county had thrown at it. She repaired the fences herself that first spring, learning to splice wire the way Wade had shown her, blistering her hands raw before she got it right. The barn roof took 2 summers of saved money to fix properly. The house smelled of dust and neglect for months. But by the second winter, it smelled like wood smoke and cattle feed, and against all odds, home. Everett Colm drove past the Harmon place, the Braddock place, now, nearly 2 years later, on his way to a cattle contract negotiation 3 miles down the road. He saw green pasture where there had been none, fences standing straight, a small herd grazing near a draw lined with cottonwoods that had never once, in 60 years, gone thirsty. He stopped his truck at the gate, just for a moment, and found Eleanor out by the mending fence near the road. "You knew," he said, not quite a question. "I had a hunch," she said, "and a husband who never got the chance to check it himself." Colm nodded slowly, the way a man does when he's finally handed the last piece of a puzzle he'd spent months turning over. "I had engineers, lawyers, a dozen reports." He looked past her, toward the water he'd once wanted so badly. "You had a story nobody else was listening to." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Eleanor said. He didn't argue. He just tipped his hat and drove on toward whatever deal was waiting for him next, leaving behind a ranch that had, quietly, become exactly what it was always meant to be. Land doesn't lie. It just waits for someone patient enough to listen. Eleanor Braddock didn't win that auction with money she didn't have. She won it with attention, with a husband's half-finished story, a father's lifelong lessons, and a stubborn refusal to let either one go to waste. The richest man in the county had every advantage except one. He was looking at the land for what it could give him. She was looking at it for what it already was. That's the story of the Harmon Ranch, and it's the story of 100 forgotten places just like it, scattered across the Nebraska plains. Places that look like failure until the right person walks the ground and asks the right question. So tell us, where are you watching from tonight? And be honest, if you were standing in that crowd in 1983, watching a young widow go card for card against the richest man in the county, would you have bet on her? Would you have taken that same risk, staking everything on a story nobody else believed? If stories like this one move you, stories of forgotten land, hard-won resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to hold on when everyone tells you to let go, subscribe to the Farmlands Files, and stay with us for the next forgotten chapter of rural American history.